She locked the door. She fastened the chain. She went to bed. By sunrise, she was gone. No forced entry. No broken balcony lock. No screams. No body. Just an empty cabin floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and a mystery that would take 19 years, and one hidden photograph, to expose a killer hiding in plain sight. Tell me where you're watching from, and after this story, you may never look at cruise ships the same way again. What happened to Cherie Marie Henderson on the night of June 8, 2004, aboard the MS Coral Princess, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, is one of the most baffling disappearances in American maritime history. It is a story about a young woman who saved for a year and a half to give herself 1 week of joy. It is a story about a family shattered into pieces that would never fully fit back together again. It is a story about a predator who operated in the shadows for over a decade, exploiting every gap in a system designed to protect the people it was quietly destroying. And it is a story about how, nearly 2 decades later, a single photograph, taken in a moment of panic by a terrified young man who then buried it under his bed and tried to forget, pulled the truth back to the surface. Because the ocean keeps its secrets poorly. And guilt, no matter how carefully you seal it away, has a way of surviving the years. Stay with us. This is the full story, from beginning to verdict. And I promise you, you will not believe how this case finally broke open. If this story already has your full attention, hit that like button and subscribe to Cold Case Solved. Every case we cover is a real family still waiting to be heard. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Let's get started. Cherie Marie Henderson was born in Jacksonville, Florida in October of 1982. Her mother, Linda, was a nurse at Baptist Medical Center. Her father, Michael, owned a small construction company. They lived in a comfortable suburban home in the Mandarin neighborhood, a backyard pool, a golden retriever named Biscuit, and a life that could be described, without exaggeration, as genuinely happy. Cherie was their only child. A surprise, as Linda would later tell investigators, who arrived when Linda was 40 years old and Michael was 43. They had long since stopped hoping. And then there she was. A miracle wearing tiny hospital socks. From her earliest years, Cherie was drawn to creative things. Art class. Drama club. Spiral notebooks she kept hidden under her bed, filled with stories she was writing for no one but herself. Her high school yearbook listed her ambition as, and these are her exact words, written in her own hand, to make people happy through advertising. She meant every syllable. After graduating from Florida State University with a degree in marketing and a minor in graphic design, she landed her first real job at Henderson Creative Group in Jacksonville. No relation to her family, just a coincidence that made her laugh when she told people about it. It was entry-level work, social media management, copywriting for small accounts, but Cherie attacked it with the energy of someone who understood that every door starts as a small one. Her supervisor would later tell investigators that Cherie had the kind of presence that lifted everyone around her. She remembered birthdays. She brought in homemade cookies. She stayed late to help colleagues meet deadlines, even when the work wasn't hers to carry. The cruise was supposed to be her college graduation gift to herself, delayed by a few months while she settled into the new job and saved her money. Her best friend from college, Emma, had been meant to come along. A family emergency forced Emma to cancel at the last minute. Cherie thought about backing out. She debated it. And then she posted to her Facebook page with the kind of quiet determination that people who knew her would have recognized immediately. Solo adventure time. If not now, when? She had saved for 18 months. She had earned this. And on the morning of June 8, 2004, Cherie Marie Henderson boarded the MS Coral Princess at the port of Miami, carrying a suitcase and the particular lightness of someone who has finally given themselves permission to exhale. The champagne flutes caught the afternoon light as passengers toasted departure on the upper deck. Miami's skyline shimmered in the June heat behind them, growing smaller with every passing minute. Cherie stood at the railing in her sundress, watching pelicans skim the turquoise water. The ship's horn sounded as they cleared Government Cut. And she felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight since finals week, since job interviews, since the relentless pressure of proving herself in a world that doesn't hand you anything. She had no way of knowing that within 48 hours, she would disappear completely. And that by the time the sun rose on June 10, the investigation into her disappearance would already be stalling out against a wall of locked doors, limited jurisdiction, and one man's carefully constructed silence. Cherie had made friends quickly on board, as she always did. By the second morning, she had fallen into a comfortable routine with a retired couple from Tallahassee named the Mortons, who she had met over breakfast on the Lido deck. Mrs. Morton liked her scrambled eggs with hot sauce. Mr. Morton always grabbed too many pastries and then made self-deprecating jokes about his cardiologist. And Cherie ordered the same thing every single morning without fail: Greek yogurt with fresh berries, black coffee, and wheat toast. She was a creature of habit. Reliable. Punctual. Enthusiastic about everything from the sunrise over the water to the dessert menu. She studied with genuine deliberation each night. They had plans for the third morning. 8:30 sharp, same as always, same table. But when 8:30 came and went with no sign of Cherie, Mrs. Morton felt the first flutter of something she didn't want to name. By 9, it had grown. By 9:30, the Mortons walked down to cabin 7312 on deck 7 and knocked. Silence. They knocked again, harder this time, calling her name. A steward passing the corridor with fresh linen stopped and asked if there was a problem. Mr. Morton explained. The steward, a young man from the Philippines named Carlos Reyes, 23 years old and new to the job, used his master key and opened the door. It opened 6 inches. Then stopped. The security chain was fastened from the inside. Through that narrow gap, they could see everything. Cherie's unmade bed. Her suitcase open on the floor. A half-drunk bottle of water on the nightstand. Her sandals placed neatly by the closet. Her novel, face down on the small desk. Her phone charging by the bed, still plugged in. Her purse hanging on the chair. And inside that purse, undisturbed, her credit cards, her ID, her passport. Everything was there. Everything except Cherie. Carlos called his supervisor. His supervisor called security. Security called the bridge. Within 20 minutes, a crowd had gathered in the narrow corridor. The ship's security chief, a former Miami-Dade police officer named Robert Kimball, arrived, assessed the situation, and made the decision to force entry. They cut the security chain with bolt cutters. The room was exactly what it had appeared to be through that 6-inch gap. Occupied but empty. Personal belongings scattered in the casual way of someone who fully intended to return. The sliding glass door to the balcony was closed. Kimball checked the lock. It was secured from the inside. He checked it again, because the alternative to it being locked from the inside was a conclusion he wasn't ready to reach yet. The bathroom stood open, shower dry, towels untouched since housekeeping's morning visit the previous day. No sign of struggle. No blood. No note. No indication whatsoever of what had happened to the young woman whose entire life was still sitting in that cabin, patiently waiting for her to come back. The mathematics of the situation defied logic. The cabin door had been locked and chained from within. The balcony door was secured internally. There was no other way out of that room. Cherie Henderson was a 5'4" woman who had just graduated with honors from one of the most respected universities in the state of Florida. She was not a magician. She was not an escape artist. She could not walk through walls. Yet somehow, between approximately 11 o'clock at night on June 8, when the neighbor in the adjacent cabin heard Cherie's television playing through the thin wall, and 8 o'clock the following morning, when housekeeping knocked and received no answer, she had vanished from a locked room floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. 200 miles from the nearest land. Kimball initiated the cruise line's missing person protocol immediately. The captain ordered a full stop and began circling back along their route while crew members searched every public space, every storage room, every restricted area. Announcements went out over the PA system. Cherie's photo, pulled from her passenger manifest, appeared on every screen throughout the ship. Auburn hair that fell past her shoulders. Bright green eyes. A smile that every person who knew her described the same way: infectious. She had last been seen at dinner the previous evening. Her tablemates reported she had seemed completely fine, excited, even, about reaching Cozumel the next day. She had ordered the grilled mahi-mahi, posted a photo of her dessert to Instagram, and excused herself around 9 in the evening, saying she wanted to call her mom before she went to sleep. That she wanted to get a good night's rest before they docked. That was the last confirmed sighting of Cherie Marie Henderson. The United States Coast Guard was notified. They launched a search pattern covering 72 square miles of ocean. Helicopters flew grid after grid. The cruise ship retraced its path while crew members lined the rails with binoculars. They searched for 6 hours. They found nothing. No debris. No clothing. No body. Maritime law required the ship to continue to its next port. On June 10, at 3 in the afternoon, the MS Coral Princess docked in Cozumel with one passenger unaccounted for. FBI agents boarded. They interviewed crew members. They re-examined the cabin. They reviewed every frame of security footage they could access. The cameras confirmed Cherie returning to cabin 7312 at 9:17 in the evening on June 8. She was alone, talking on her cell phone, visibly smiling. She used her key card. The door closed behind her. The nearest camera, positioned 30 feet away near the elevator bank, showed no one else approaching her door for the rest of the night. Investigators pulled the ship's technical logs. No crew override key had been used on Cherie's door. No anomalies. No irregularities. Just a locked door and a woman who had ceased to exist somewhere inside it. Her balcony sat 40 feet above the waterline. To go overboard from there, you would need to climb a 4-foot railing. Difficult but not impossible. But the balcony door was locked from the inside. If she had climbed over that railing, how did she lock it behind her? And more to the point, why would she? Suicide was considered and quickly dismissed. She had made plans for the rest of the cruise, a snorkeling excursion in Grand Cayman, a spa appointment the following afternoon. She had prepaid for both. Her mother, when contacted by authorities, was adamant. Cherie had been in wonderful spirits. She had just started her dream job. She was planning to move into her own apartment that fall. She had been talking, in their last phone call, about adopting a dog. These are not the plans of someone preparing to disappear. Linda Henderson received the call from the cruise line on June 10 while she was preparing lunch in her kitchen. The voice on the other end was professional, apologetic, and devastating. Your daughter is missing. We have conducted a thorough search. The Coast Guard is involved. We are doing everything we can. Linda's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the kitchen floor with the phone still pressed to her ear. Michael was on a job site in Orange Park. When his wife's call reached him, he dropped his clipboard where he stood and drove home doing 80 miles an hour with his hands shaking on the wheel. Within hours, the Henderson family had converged on the FBI field office in Jacksonville, demanding answers that no one was able to provide. Linda, who had brought her daughter into the world at 40 years old, who had taught Cherie to swim in their backyard pool, who had helped her pick out her prom dress, sat in a government waiting room and tried to make sense of something that could not be made sensible. Michael, who had always been the practical one, the problem solver, the man who built things with his hands and fixed what was broken, found himself utterly unable to fix this. He asked every question his wife couldn't form. What was the last thing she ate? Who was the last person to see her? Why wasn't there more camera coverage? Why hadn't anyone noticed she was missing sooner? The agents were patient and thorough and ultimately unable to offer comfort, because the truth was they simply did not know. They had a locked room mystery in international waters, and the laws governing such cases were a labyrinth of jurisdictional ambiguity. The cruise line's corporate headquarters was in Liberia. The ship was registered in Panama. The incident had occurred in the Atlantic Ocean. American citizens were involved, which gave the FBI authority to investigate. But evidence was scarce and getting scarcer with every hour the ship continued on its route. Linda became the family's public voice. She gave interviews to local news stations. She held press conferences outside the federal building. She created a Facebook page. This was the early days of social media, and the page went viral in a way that felt, briefly, like it might amount to something. Find Cherie Henderson. Thousands of followers. Tips pouring in from as far away as Costa Rica and Portugal. Every single one of them a dead end. The family hired a maritime attorney named Benjamin Torres, out of Miami, who was known for being relentless. Torres filed motions demanding the cruise line preserve all records, all footage, all crew employment files. He deposed ship personnel. He requested passenger lists and cross-referenced them against criminal databases. He found minor discrepancies, a crew member with a suspended license, another with an old domestic violence charge, but nothing that pointed directly to Cherie. The cruise line's legal team stonewalled at every turn, citing privacy protections and corporate policy. Torres pushed harder. He got a judge to order the release of maintenance logs. What he found was troubling, though not conclusive. On the night Cherie disappeared, a routine inspection of the ship's water filtration system had been scheduled for Deck 7, her deck. The inspection was logged as completed by a maintenance technician. But there was no secondary signature. No supervisor verification. This violated the cruise line's own protocol. Torres flagged it in a legal brief. The cruise line responded that the missing signature was an administrative oversight, nothing more. Torres wasn't satisfied. But without additional evidence, he had nowhere to push. Months became years. The Henderson family held annual vigils at Jacksonville Beach, lighting candles at sunset, releasing white balloons into the evening sky. Local news stations covered the first few anniversaries, then stopped. Public attention is a finite resource, and new tragedies constantly compete for space. Linda kept Cherie's bedroom exactly as it had been, college textbooks on the shelf, vintage concert posters on the walls, her favorite quilt folded at the foot of the bed. Linda dusted it every single week. Michael withdrew to his workshop and spent long hours building furniture he never finished. The Facebook page kept running, though engagement dwindled year by year to a handful of faithful followers who still showed up on Cherie's birthday, on the anniversary of her disappearance, on holidays. The FBI kept the case open but assigned no active agents to it. The file gathered dust in a cabinet in the Jacksonville field office. One more cold Maritime case among dozens with no clear resolution and no one left to push it forward. Except Linda Henderson. Who never stopped. Derek Langford was 26 years old on the night of June 8, 2004. He was a maintenance technician aboard the MS Coral Princess, 3 years into what had so far been a good career, decent pay, the chance to see the world on someone else's dime, the quiet satisfaction of a man who was good with his hands and knew it. What he saw that night changed the shape of the rest of his life. Not immediately, not in the way that forces a person into action. But slowly, the way a stone dropped into still water eventually reaches every edge of the surface. He had been conducting his rounds. Standard maintenance check on the filtration access panels in the service corridors behind the passenger decks. These corridors were part of the ship's hidden skeleton, running parallel to the public hallways, allowing crew members to move through the entire vessel without passengers ever seeing them. Langford knew these passages the way you know the inside of your own home. He had his digital camera out, the one he used to photograph equipment's serial numbers for his reports, because he had noticed an access panel slightly ajar and protocol required documenting any irregularity. He approached it, and as he did, he glanced to his left. Cabin 7312 had its door cracked open about 6 inches. Not wide. But enough. Cherie was sitting on her bed in her nightclothes. Standing over her was a figure in a maintenance uniform, back turned to Langford, holding something, a small bottle, a cloth pressed against it. And Cherie's expression was wrong in a way that Langford would spend 19 years trying to describe. Not scared, exactly. Confused. Drowsy. Like she was fighting to stay conscious and losing. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Langford's radio crackled, his supervisor checking in, and the sound made him flinch. The figure in the cabin turned slightly. Langford caught a glimpse of a profile. And then he panicked. He ducked back around the corner, heart hammering, hands shaking. He fumbled with his camera and snapped one photograph before retreating down the corridor as quietly and quickly as his legs would carry him. He told himself he wasn't sure what he had seen. He told himself it was probably nothing, maybe she had asked for a maintenance check, maybe she wasn't feeling well, maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation and he had let his imagination get ahead of him. He finished his shift. He went to his cabin. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and tried to believe the story he was telling himself. The next morning, the announcement came over the PA system. A passenger was missing. Cabin 7312 on deck 7. Cherie Henderson. Please report any information to ship security immediately. Langford's blood went cold. And then the fear that had already been building in him calcified into something he would carry for the next 19 years. How could he come forward without admitting he had seen something the night before and stayed silent? He would be implicated. They would ask why he waited. They would wonder if he was involved. The person in that cabin had been wearing a maintenance uniform, someone with crew access, someone who knew the ship's hidden passages. If Langford reported what he had seen and got it wrong, he could lose his job. If he got it right, he would be a witness against someone dangerous. And he would be a witness who had waited. So he said nothing. He kept the photograph in a manila envelope, tucked it into a lockbox under his bed with some half-formed notion that if things went wrong someday, at least he would have proof that he had documented something. And then the investigation closed, and the case went cold, and Derek Langford left the cruise industry entirely and became a building superintendent in Tampa and got married and had 2 daughters and coached their soccer teams and built a life that looked, from the outside, like a normal, decent, ordinary life. But guilt is patient. It waits. It accumulates interest. By 2023, Langford was 50 years old. His daughters were in college. His marriage was stable. He was starting to think about the kind of man he wanted to be remembered as. And he could not stop seeing Cherie Henderson's face, not the photograph he had taken, but the one from the old news broadcasts, the one her family had distributed to every television station in Florida. Auburn hair. Green eyes. That infectious smile. In March of 2023, Derek Langford made an appointment with the FBI field office in Tampa. He brought the manila envelope. He told them exactly what he had seen on the night of June 8, 2004. And he told them who he believed was in that cabin. If you are still with us at this point in the story, and I mean really with us, drop a comment right now that says, "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this case. Because what comes next is where everything changes. Special Agent Nicole Ortiz had been with the Bureau for 11 years. She had worked dozens of cold cases and had long since learned not to let herself feel hope until she actually saw what people brought through the door. Most tips on old cases led nowhere. Faulty memories. Attention seekers. Well-meaning civilians who had confused a dream with a recollection. She sat across from Derek Langford in interview room C with her recorder running and her expression professionally neutral. But she noticed something about him. He wasn't performing. He was ashamed. That was the tell. He slid the manila envelope across the table. Inside was a 4x6 photograph, the kind printed from a digital camera in the early 2000s. Colors slightly faded. Edges worn from years of handling, of being taken out and looked at and put away again. The image showed a section of corridor on what was unmistakably a cruise ship, industrial carpet, numbered cabin doors, the sconce lighting that Ortiz recognized from the MS Coral Princess deck plans she had pulled from the archive that very morning after Langford called to make his appointment. Through a partially open door, cabin 7312, the numbers visible on the placard, a young woman could be seen sitting on the edge of a bed. Her face was turned towards someone just outside the frame. The woman was Cherie Henderson. The time stamp in the corner read June 8, 2004. 10:47 in the evening. This was the missing window. The 90 minutes between Cherie's last confirmed sighting on the security footage and the beginning of a night that no one had been able to account for. And here was evidence that someone had been in her cabin during that window. Someone in a uniform. Someone with access. Ortiz called in her partner, Agent Marcus Webb. They studied the image together, cross-referencing it against the original case file. Then Webb escalated to the cold case unit supervisor, and by 5 in the afternoon, they had assembled a task force. The first order of business was identifying the figure in the photograph. Enhanced imaging software, technology that did not exist in 2004, extracted what details it could. Male. Approximately 6 feet tall. Broad-shouldered. Standard cruise ship maintenance coveralls with the company logo on the breast pocket. And on his right hip, clipped to his belt, a large ring of keys. The kind issued only to senior technical staff. Not every maintenance worker carried that ring. It indicated seniority. Specialized clearance. The team pulled the crew roster for June 8, 2004. 23 maintenance personnel had been on duty. 14 were ruled out immediately, wrong build, wrong shift, verifiably elsewhere during the relevant window. That left 9 possible suspects. 3 had since died from unrelated causes. 2 had relocated to countries without extradition treaties. That left 4 viable names. 1 rose above the rest almost immediately. Christopher Paul Vega. 51 years old at the time of the investigation. He had been 32 on the night Cherie disappeared. 16 years with the cruise line, rising from junior mechanic to senior maintenance engineer by 2003. His personnel file was immaculate, exemplary performance reviews, multiple commendations, not a single disciplinary action on record. But when agents dug into his personal history, cracks appeared. In 1998, while working a Caribbean route, a female passenger had filed a complaint alleging that Vega had entered her cabin uninvited under the pretense of checking the air conditioning. The cruise line investigated internally. The complaint was dismissed due to lack of evidence. The passenger did not pursue it further. In 2001, a crew member, a housekeeper, claimed Vega had made unwanted advances in a service corridor. Another internal review. Another inconclusive finding. Vega remained employed. The cruise line settled both matters quietly. Standard procedure. Designed to avoid litigation and negative press. Absolutely standard. And absolutely devastating in what it allowed to continue. There was a pattern here. Access. Opportunity. A history of boundary violations with no meaningful consequences. And then this, Vega's work schedule on June 8, 2004, placed him on mechanical inspections for Deck 6 and Deck 7 between 9 in the evening and midnight. The exact time frame. The exact location. Agents obtained a warrant for Vega's current residence in Homestead, just south of Miami. They executed it on April 3, 2023, at 6 in the morning. Vega answered the door in his sleepwear, confused and indignant. The search team spent 4 hours going through his belongings. They found nothing in the duplex itself that connected him directly to Cherie Henderson. But in a storage unit he rented 15 miles away, in a cardboard box labeled ship stuff, they found something that stopped the search team cold. A set of master override keys. The kind that could open any cabin door on the MS Coral Princess regardless of whether it was locked from the inside or secured by a chain. Keys that, by every protocol in existence, should have been surrendered to the cruise line when Vega left his employment 17 years earlier. Keys he had kept. For reasons he could not explain. A locksmith and maritime security expert named Gerald Fitzsimmons was brought in to analyze them. 30 years of experience with cruise ship security systems. His conclusions were unambiguous. These keys represented the highest level of access on the vessel. They could override electronic locks, disengage security chains from the outside using a specialized instrument, and open maintenance hatches throughout the ship. In the wrong hands, they were skeleton keys to every private space aboard. Fitzsimmons explained the mechanics. The security chain inside Cherie's cabin could be released externally if someone inserted a thin, rigid tool through the door gap and manipulated the slider. It required skill. It required knowing exactly what you were doing. But it was entirely possible for someone who had done it before. This was the answer to the locked room. This was how she could have secured her door from inside before going to sleep, and how someone could have entered anyway, and how that same person could have resecured the chain behind them on the way out. The question was no longer how. The question was now who. Under microscopic analysis at the FBI forensic lab, one of those keys yielded traces of DNA. Female DNA. Degraded by time. Partial. But sufficient for comparison. On April 19, the lab in Quantico called with the results. Special Agent Nicole Ortiz was sitting in her car outside a coffee shop in Tampa, halfway through a drink that had gone cold. Dr. Karen Yates, the forensic geneticist who had processed the sample, spoke in the careful language of scientific certainty: 13 genetic markers, mitochondrial DNA analysis, probability calculations that exceeded 1 in 7 billion. The DNA on that key belonged to Cherie Henderson. There was no room for doubt. The discovery transformed the investigation from circumstantial theory into prosecutable fact. But DNA alone is a sentence, not a story. The task force needed to reconstruct what had actually happened on the night of June 8, 2004, using forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the cold logic of sequence. They began with the timeline. Cherie returned to her cabin at 9:17 in the evening, confirmed by security footage. She changed into her nightclothes, brushed her teeth, settled into bed. At some point before 10:47, the timestamp on Langford's photograph, someone knocked on her door. Perhaps presenting it as routine. A maintenance check. A safety inspection. Something that, at 9 o'clock on a cruise ship, you open your door for without thinking twice. She let them in. She returned to the bed. She assumed they would do their work and leave. Toxicology experts provided the theory for what happened next. Chloroform, or a similar volatile anesthetic applied via cloth, can induce rapid unconsciousness, within 2 to 3 minutes of sustained exposure. The substance metabolizes quickly and leaves little trace in the absence of a body. But the behavior visible in Langford's photograph was entirely consistent with chemical sedation. The posture. The confused expression. The absence of resistance. She was incapacitated before she fully understood what was happening to her. What followed can only be inferred. But the physical evidence suggests a grim sequence. Vega had access to the service corridors that ran behind the passenger decks, the same hidden passages through which he had moved, legitimately, for 16 years. These corridors connected to cargo holds, mechanical rooms, and waste management systems. They were monitored by cameras in some sections. But budget cuts and outdated equipment had left blind spots throughout the ship, and a senior maintenance engineer who had worked those passages for years would have known exactly where every one of those blind spots was. A data analyst named Timothy Chen, working with the FBI's cyber division, recovered deleted entries from the MS Coral Princess waste management system. The log showed an unscheduled activation of refuse chute D, located on Deck 4, directly below the service corridor where the steward Carlos Reyes had reported seeing Vega carrying a large canvas laundry bag at 11 in the evening. The activation occurred at 11:51 at night on June 8. Less than 2 minutes. No corresponding waste disposal logged in the official records. Someone had used that chute without authorization, and then deleted the entry. Vega's crew key card had accessed a restricted mechanical room on Deck 4 at 11:48 that same night. The room housed electrical panels and provided direct access to the refuse chute system. The ship's navigational position at that moment placed them in a section of the Atlantic with an average depth of 16,000 feet. Recovery would be impossible. The pieces interlocked with terrible precision. Vega had entered Cherie's cabin using his override keys. He had incapacitated her. He had transported her body through the service corridors, avoiding every camera, to the mechanical room on Deck 4. And he had disposed of her at sea, then deleted the waste system entry, something only someone with senior technical clearance could do. By the time the sun rose on June 9, there was nothing left to find. No body. No evidence. No Cherie. Just a locked cabin that should have been impossible to enter. And a man who went back to work the next morning and said nothing. Christopher Paul Vega was born in Pensacola in 1972 to a single mother who cleaned hotel rooms along the Gulf Coast. His father was a Navy sailor who shipped out before Vega's birth and never returned. He grew up in extended-stay motels and apartments that smelled of bleach and cigarette smoke. His mother worked double shifts and left him alone for hours at a stretch. Neighbors from those years remembered him as quiet, polite, a little too eager to help. He would offer to carry groceries, fix broken appliances, water plants while people were away. Most found it kind. A few found it unsettling in a way they couldn't fully articulate, the way he lingered in doorways, asking questions about when people would be home, whether they lived alone. At 16, he dropped out of high school and took a job at a marina, learning boat mechanics. By 20, he had earned marine engineering certifications. The cruise industry hired him in 1988. For the next 18 years, he moved between ships, maintaining exemplary work records, volunteering for night shifts and overtime, making himself indispensable. He was the employee who knew every corridor, every locked door, every camera blind spot. He had made himself into a man no one would ever think to suspect. After his arrest, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit conducted a comprehensive investigation into Vega's full employment history, cross-referencing it against unsolved disappearances on cruise ships dating back to the 1990s. What they found over the weeks that followed was, by every measure, chilling. Between 1996 and 2006, 10 years, at least 6 women had vanished from vessels where Vega worked. 6 women who boarded cruise ships and simply ceased to exist. Some had been written off as suicides. Women who allegedly jumped overboard, though not a single witness had seen them go. Others had been classified as accidents, slip-and-fall incidents near railings, late-night mishaps blamed on alcohol. One had been ruled a medical emergency, a woman who supposedly suffered a cardiac event and was buried at sea per maritime protocol before the ship reached port. Her family had protested. Had demanded investigations. Had received settlements and silence in return. Every missing woman had been traveling alone. Every disappearance occurred during night hours. And in every case, Vega had been working the maintenance shift in the relevant section of the ship. Agents traveled to San Diego to interview the family of Rebecca Chen, a 28-year-old accountant who had vanished from a Pacific cruise in 1998. Rebecca's sister Amy had spent 25 years demanding answers. When Agent Ortiz showed her Vega's photograph, the color drained from her face. She remembered him. Rebecca had mentioned him during a phone call from one of the ports. Said a maintenance guy had come to her cabin twice in 2 days to check the plumbing, even though nothing was wrong. Rebecca had found it odd but not threatening. She had laughed about it, called him overly thorough. 3 days later, she was gone. Her cabin had been found locked from the inside. Her belongings undisturbed. The official report concluded she had likely gone overboard, though no one witnessed it. Amy had never believed it for a single day of those 25 years. Rebecca wasn't suicidal. She didn't drink heavily. She was responsible and careful, and she was planning to start her own firm when she got home. Now, a quarter of a century later, Amy finally understood. Her sister had been murdered by a man who had spent a decade perfecting his method. Who had learned to exploit every gap in a system that had consistently chosen its own liability over the safety of the women in its care. The rage and grief that moved across Amy Chen's face when she finally understood made Agent Ortiz look away. Some truths arrived too late to be anything but unbearable. In May of 2023, armed with DNA evidence, a 19-year-old photograph, witness testimony, recovered digital forensics, and a reconstructed timeline that left almost no room for alternative interpretation, federal prosecutors charged Christopher Paul Vega with the kidnapping and murder of Cherie Marie Henderson. The arrest at his homestead duplex was quiet. No confusion this time about why they had come. Vega said nothing. Invoked his right to counsel. Was transported to the federal detention center in Miami. He would say very little of substance for the remainder of the legal proceedings. News of the arrest exploded across Florida media. The Henderson family, notified hours earlier by Agent Ortiz in a conference room at the Jacksonville FBI field office, experienced something that did not have a clean name. Not relief. Not closure. Something more complicated and more painful. The end of uncertainty. The beginning of a grief that now finally had a shape. Linda Henderson told reporters that knowing what happened to her daughter did not ease the pain. But it ended the torture of not knowing. And those were two very different things. Michael Henderson, now 66 years old and gray-haired from years of grief that had never been able to fully resolve into mourning, said quietly that he had always known someone had taken his daughter. Now that someone had a name and a face. The trial began in September of 2023 at the federal courthouse in Miami. The prosecution called 38 witnesses over 4 weeks. Derek Langford testified about the photograph, his voice steady, his shame visible, the defense's attempts to characterize him as an unreliable narrator falling largely flat against the simple weight of what he had carried for 19 years and finally chosen to put down. Carlos Reyes described the laundry bag, the timing, Vega's unexplained presence in a service corridor at 11 in the evening with no legitimate reason to be there. Dr. Karen Yates explained the DNA evidence with a precision that left no interpretive daylight. Timothy Chen walked the jury through the deleted waste system logs, the key card access records, the navigational data, all of it converging on the same night, the same ship, the same man. Maritime experts testified about the vessel's layout, its security gaps, the ease with which a senior maintenance engineer who had worked the ship's hidden passages for years could move an unconscious woman from a 7th-floor cabin to a 4th-floor mechanical room without ever appearing on a single camera. The most devastating testimony of the entire trial came from Linda Henderson. She took the stand on the 14th day, wearing a simple black dress and a silver necklace that had belonged to her daughter. When the prosecutor asked her to describe Cherie, not as a victim, but as a person, Linda spoke for 20 minutes without notes, without hesitation. She described a young woman who loved art museums and terrible reality television with equal and unembarrassed devotion. Who volunteered at animal shelters on weekends. Who sent postcards from every trip she had ever taken, and not the generic kind, hand-selected cards with personal messages that made you feel like she had been thinking specifically about you. She described the burned popcorn, a recurring domestic disaster that had required the replacement of 2 microwaves. She described Cherie crying at commercials about shelter dogs. She described a person who believed, genuinely and without cynicism, that the world was made up of mostly good people. She described the last conversation they had had, 2 days before Cherie boarded the ship. Cherie had been excited. A little nervous about traveling alone for the first time, but determined to prove to herself that she could do it. Linda had told her to be safe. To call from every port. Cherie had promised she would. When the prosecutor asked Linda what the past 19 years had been like, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said that it had been like living with a ghost. That her daughter was everywhere and nowhere, in old photographs, in voicemails Linda could not bring herself to delete, in the chair that stayed empty at every family gathering. That not knowing what had happened was a special kind of torture. Worse than grief in certain ways. Because grief has shape. Grief can be lived with, and eventually lived through. Uncertainty just festers. It never resolves. It never lets you finish. Several jurors were visibly crying by the time Linda stepped down from the stand. Vega never testified. His attorney knew what cross-examination would do to him. He sat through 4 weeks of evidence with an expression that forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Clifton, watching from the gallery, described as detached and clinical, observing the proceedings as though they concerned someone else entirely. This, she noted, was consistent with her evaluation of him. Vega did not experience himself as a monster. Predators rarely do. They construct internal narratives that allow them to rationalize what they have done, narratives in which the people they harmed were somehow less real, less deserving of consideration, more object than human being. It is a psychology, Clifton explained, that tends to flourish in environments that provide access to vulnerable people with limited oversight. Hospitality. Transportation. Healthcare. Cruise ships in international waters, where jurisdiction is unclear and evidence has a habit of disappearing. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts, first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and 3 additional charges related to tampering with evidence and making false statements to federal investigators. The courtroom erupted in gasps and sobs. Linda Henderson collapsed into her husband's arms. Michael sat motionless with tears streaming down his face. Linda's sister Carol closed her eyes and whispered something private, a prayer, a message to Cherie, something the rest of the room was not meant to hear. At sentencing, Federal Judge Helena Vasquez addressed Vega directly before announcing her decision. She spoke about the 6 women whose cases were still under investigation. The families who had spent decades in agony without answers. The systemic failures that had created the conditions in which someone like Vega could operate for over a decade without consequence. She noted that he had shown no remorse. Offered no explanation. Given the families nothing. She sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, plus 60 additional years on the remaining counts, to be served consecutively in a maximum security federal facility. Vega's face remained blank. He was let out through a side door that closed behind him with an echoing finality. And that was the last time most of the people in that courtroom would ever see him in a context that mattered. Outside, Linda Henderson stood before the cameras and said something that would be quoted in newspapers across the country and shared across the internet in the days that followed. Justice is supposed to be blind, but it should not be slow. 19 years is too long. 6 women is 6 too many. We have to do better. The memorial service was held on a Saturday in November, 6 weeks after the sentencing, on a stretch of Jacksonville Beach where the Henderson family had gathered every year since 2004. The sky was overcast, the kind of soft gray that makes the ocean look like pewter and the world feel quieter than it usually is. Nearly 200 people assembled near the dunes. Someone had built a small platform from driftwood and adorned it with white roses, photographs of Cherie at various ages, and 6 white candles, 1 for each woman. Linda Henderson stood at the center, her husband and sister flanking her. There was something different about her today. Not lighter, exactly. A woman who has lived through 19 years of what Linda lived through does not simply become lighter. But something had shifted. A weight that had been carried for so long it had begun to feel like part of the body had been, at least partially, set down. She spoke about her daughter. Not as a victim. Not as a case number or a legal precedent or a cautionary tale. As the person she had been, in all her specific, irreplaceable particularity. The burned popcorn. The shelter dog commercials. The belief that the world was mostly good. A belief that had, in the end, contributed to her death, because she had opened a door that night without fear, because she had been taught by the people who loved her that most people can be trusted. Linda spoke about the cost of silence. About Derek Langford's 19-year delay, which had haunted him so thoroughly that it had eventually compelled him back into the light. She didn't excuse what he had done. But she said she understood it. Fear makes us smaller than we are. It convinces us that speaking up will cost more than staying quiet. But silence has its own price, she said. It is paid in sleepless nights and in questions that accumulate like interest on a debt you can never fully repay. Langford was there, standing toward the back of the crowd with his head bowed. When Linda said his name, people around him turned to look. He didn't meet their eyes. Agent Ortiz stood beside him. She had driven up from Tampa specifically for this service, had told Langford he should come, that the family wanted him there, that redemption was still something available to him if he chose to reach for it. He had been skeptical. But he came. Listening to Linda, he felt something give way in his chest. Not absolution. Not yet, maybe not ever fully. But the beginning of something that might, in time, grow into it. Michael Henderson stepped forward carrying a small wooden box he had carved himself during the long years of waiting. Inside were fragments, Cherie's college graduation tassel. A pressed flower from her apartment windowsill. A silver bracelet she had worn until the clasp wore out. And a note she had written to her mother on some long-ago birthday that said simply, in her own handwriting, "Thanks for everything, Mom. I love you." Michael opened the box and let the wind take what was inside. The crowd watched in silence as the small objects scattered and tumbled and disappeared into the surf. It was a burial of sorts. The kind that doesn't require a body. An acknowledgement that Cherie was gone, that the ocean had kept her, and that this gathering, this grief, this refusal to let her become a footnote, was as close to bringing her home as they would ever be able to get. Then Linda stepped to the microphone and read the names aloud. Rebecca Chen. Vanished in 1998. Lauren DeMarco. Vanished in 2000. Simone Broussard. Vanished in 2002. Angela Petro. Vanished in 2003. Cherie Henderson. Vanished in 2004. Maya Okonkwo. Vanished in 2006. 6 names. 6 lives interrupted. 6 families given the terrible, necessary, long overdue gift of knowing. The crowd sang Amazing Grace. Some from memory. Others just hummed along, the melody carrying across the sand and out over the water. A few people couldn't manage any sound at all and simply stood there with tears on their faces, bearing witness the only way they had left. After the singing ended, a young woman stepped out of the crowd. She was in her mid-20s, dressed in jeans and a university sweatshirt, dark hair pulled back. She introduced herself to Linda as Erin. She said she had been following the case online. She said she needed to share something. 2 years earlier, she had taken a cruise with her boyfriend. On the second night, a crew member, maintenance, she thought, based on the uniform, had knocked on her cabin door around 11 in the evening, claiming he needed to check a reported leak. She had let him in. He had gone into the bathroom, spent a few minutes looking under the sink, and then left. But something about the encounter had felt wrong. The way he had looked at her. The fact that when she asked at the front desk the next day, there was no record of the visit and no reported leak. Her boyfriend had told her she was being paranoid. She had tried to let it go. After Vega's arrest, after reading the details of his method, she had realized what had almost certainly happened. She had been assessed. And ruled out. Maybe because her boyfriend was there. Maybe because she had seemed too alert. Maybe for reasons she would never fully know. She had been standing next to something terrible and had not known it. Linda embraced her. This stranger who had never met Cherie, who had come to a memorial for a woman she did not know because she understood, in a way that was visceral and close and personal, how thin the line was between the women whose names Linda had just read aloud and the women who would never appear on any list because they had been lucky. This is the hidden mathematics of predation. For every name on the list, there are dozens of near misses. Women who felt a flicker of unease and dismissed it. Women who were saved by a coincidence they never knew they needed. Women who locked their cabin doors and went to sleep without incident and flew home at the end of the week and never thought about it again. The families of the other 5 women had traveled from across the country for this memorial, from California, Texas, New York, Louisiana, and Maryland. They had found each other in the weeks since the trial, connected by the particular bond of people who have survived the same specific catastrophe. They were planning to establish a foundation in the women's names, dedicated to advocating for cruise ship safety reform and supporting families of missing persons in the years it takes for cases like this one to reach anything resembling resolution. Agent Ortiz watched from a distance, giving the families the space they had earned. But Linda waved her over, and they stood together at the water's edge while the waves did what waves always do, arriving and departing, indifferent to the small dramas playing out on the shore. Ortiz told Linda that she had worked cold cases for over a decade, and that most of them stayed cold. Leads dried up. Witnesses died. Evidence degraded past the point of usefulness. But every once in a while, something broke open. A new technology. A guilty conscience that finally became too heavy to carry. A piece of information that had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice it at the right moment. The Henderson case had been that rare convergence of persistence, science, and a man who could no longer live inside the lie he had built around himself. But none of it, Ortiz said, would have happened without Linda's refusal to let her daughter become a footnote. That mattered. That had made all the difference. Linda smiled. A sad, exhausted, 19 years deep smile. She said she had spent all of those years angry. Angry at the cruise line, at the investigators who had given up, at Derek Langford for his silence, at a universe that could let something like this happen to a 21-year-old who just wanted 1 week of sunshine. Anger had kept her going. It had powered the Facebook posts and the press conferences and the endless phone calls to attorneys and journalists and anyone who would still listen. But now that Vega was convicted, now that she finally knew, the anger was draining away. And she said she didn't yet know what would replace it. Ortiz told her that was normal. That closure was a myth people told themselves to make the unbearable seem more manageable. You don't close a wound like this. You learn to live around it. The scar becomes part of you. And eventually, on the best days, you can carry it without it carrying you. Linda nodded. She had understood this for years. She had just, until now, needed to be angry first. The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, casting a long shaft of golden light across the water. Someone in the crowd pointed it out. Look! A god beam. People turned to watch it pour down like something that had been waiting all day for the right moment to arrive. Linda said quietly that it was Cherie. Letting them know she was okay. Michael didn't contradict her. Belief is a kindness we offer to the people we love. And if his wife needed to see their daughter in a shaft of afternoon light breaking through clouds on a November beach in Jacksonville, then that is exactly what it was. Linda walked to the driftwood platform and blew out the 6 candles one by one. The smoke curled up and thinned and disappeared. 6 flames extinguished. 6 lives honored. 6 families given the only thing left to give them, the knowledge that the world had not forgotten, and would not forget. As the crowd finally began to disperse, Linda stayed behind with her husband and sister. The 3 of them stood together in silence watching the ocean do what it had always done, long before any of them arrived on this beach and long after they were gone. Indifferent to human grief. Indifferent to justice. Indifferent to everything except the rhythm it had kept since the beginning of time. Somewhere beneath those waves, in the cold dark where light never reached, Cherie's body rested beyond recovery. But no longer beyond understanding. No longer beyond the reach of her mother's voice. The ocean had kept a secret for 19 years. But love, stubborn, relentless, unresigning love, had brought the truth home. And for a family that had been living with a ghost for nearly 2 decades, that would have to be enough. Linda reached down and picked up a smooth piece of sea glass from the wet sand at her feet. Worn soft by years of water and tide and time. She turned it over in her palm for a moment. Then she slipped it into her pocket. A fragment of something broken. Transformed, by patience and by the slow work of the sea, into something worth keeping. She turned away from the water. She walked toward the parking lot with her husband and her sister beside her, the 3 of them moving together through the fading afternoon light. Behind them, the waves came in and smoothed the sand clean, erasing every footprint, leaving the beach the way it always looked before anyone arrived, empty and open and ready for whatever came next. The truth had surfaced at last. Justice, imperfect, and 19 years late, had been served. And Cherie Marie Henderson, 21 years old, who had saved for 18 months and posted solo adventure time and boarded a ship in the port of Miami with everything still ahead of her, could finally rest. Not forgotten. Not ever forgotten. The ocean keeps its secrets poorly. But memory, the kind that a mother carries, the kind that refuses to be extinguished no matter how long the night lasts, memory keeps them forever. If this story moved you, if Cherie's name means something to you now, share this video. Post it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. 6 women deserve to have the whole world know their names. Subscribe to Cold Case Solved. Hit the bell. Leave a comment. Every case we cover is a family still waiting for someone to care enough to keep asking. We will never stop asking. This has been a Cold Case Solved investigation. If you or someone you know has information about unsolved disappearances on cruise ships, please contact the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. Every case deserves justice. Every family deserves answers. We will see you in the next one.